The first thing you notice is the scale. Not the height of a tower or the span of a wall, but something subtler, something that settles into the mind long before you understand why. A doorway cut into living stone rises far above eye level, its lintel broad enough to shelter a creature much larger than you. The steps leading toward it stretch deeper and taller than your stride expects, as if the builders measured distance with different legs entirely. The stone is cold, untouched by ornament, too precise to be chance, too massive to feel familiar. You stand before it the way one stands before a stranded ship, aware that whatever shaped it was not meant to travel beside you. In the quiet, the question returns. Why carve an entrance that no human body fits naturally into? Why shape a threshold so tall that even a mounted rider would feel small beneath it? No inscription helps. No carved figure waits nearby to explain who passed through. Only the proportions remain, and they feel older than the story you were taught. Wind moves across the surface, slipping through joints so tight a blade cannot enter. It whistles once, faintly, as if moving through a hollow that should not be there, and you sense an absence that is heavier than presence, a feeling that someone measured this place by a standard the world no longer remembers. You step back, trying to place yourself against the stones, trying to imagine a mason deciding to carve a doorway 3 times higher than necessary. There is no comfort in the comparison. You look small here, almost incidental, and in that moment one quiet thought forms, the kind that settles in the bones. If these structures were not meant for us, then who are they built for? The official story is simple enough. These places, we are told, were monuments of ceremony, power, and devotion. The oversized doorways were symbolic thresholds meant to impress approaching pilgrims. The vast staircases were processional paths, designed to elevate ritual by forcing each step to feel like a climb toward the divine. The sarcophagi that seemed too large for any recorded person were offerings, cenotaphs, or containers for objects long since removed. According to textbooks, the mismatch between human scale and architectural scale is nothing more than artistic choice or ceremonial exaggeration. It is a clean explanation, elegant in its simplicity, and for many years it has been enough. But when you walk among these places yourself, the official version begins to feel incomplete. You notice the precision with which each stone has been cut, the way surfaces align without mortar, the way angles repeat across different structures separated by continents. You feel the weight of the walls in your chest, not metaphorically but physically, as though the builders were working with mass on a scale we rarely consider today. The story says these were spaces designed for ritual, yet the proportions do not respond to human movement. Doors tower so high they destabilize perspective. Steps rise so deep they demand effort disproportionate to human legs. Chambers expand into volumes that swallow sound instead of carrying it. Everything feels slightly shifted, as though the architects accounted for a body that moved differently, stood differently, breathed differently. The mainstream narrative encourages us to see symbolism here, but symbols rarely require perfect geometry, and they almost never require engineering that strains the limits of ancient tools. These places behave less like ceremonial metaphors and more like practical architecture designed for someone who never returned. Still, the accepted explanation persists. It is comforting, after all, to believe that every ancient mystery can be resolved within familiar boundaries, that nothing must be reconsidered, that the world has always belonged to human beings alone. Yet the deeper you look, the more the edges fray. Measurements begin repeating across sites with no cultural connection. Construction choices seem tailored to proportions no ancient population possessed. And the silence surrounding certain features feels less like absence and more like intentional omission. This is where our investigation truly begins, in the space between what is said and what is seen, between the story we are told and the evidence that refuses to shrink to fit it. Because if these structures were meant for humans, the architecture has a peculiar way of forgetting our size. The first anomaly appears in places where the stone refuses to cooperate with the human story. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, a single doorway stands so precisely cut, so sharply defined, that it feels closer to a machine part than to ancient architecture. Its frame rises far above human height, its angles so exact that even modern stonemasons pause when they see it. The threshold is smooth, almost polished, as if polished by use, yet no record describes what passed through it. When you stand beside it, the sensation is unmistakable. are too small for it, uncomfortably so. Archaeologists explain the tall proportions as symbolic, a gesture meant to honour deities. But symbolic doorways do not require machining-level precision. They do not require stones weighing tens of tons to be lifted and set with tolerances measured in millimetres. And they do not usually sit at the end of corridors with no ceremonial decoration, where no ritual context has ever been found. The contradiction deepens when you examine the interior corners. They are not merely right angles, they are impossibly crisp transitions in stone so hard that iron tools struggle to leave marks. These are not cuts you make for theatrical effect, these are cuts you make when the dimensions matter. Then comes the second piece of the puzzle. The platform leading toward the doorway is made of steps so deep that the average person cannot climb them naturally. Each rise demands a full lift of the leg, like mounting a boulder. They do not match human stride, not even the stride of the tallest individuals in these populations. When modelled digitally, the steps correspond more closely to the scale of a creature roughly 1.5 times our height with a longer natural gait. Ollantaytambo is not alone. Across other Andean sites, the same pattern emerges: stairways whose proportions reject our bodies, doorways that seem designed to be walked through without effort by someone larger, someone who did not need to slow down or stoop. If all of this were decorative, the builders would not have hidden their work behind functional paths and unadorned thresholds. Architecture intended purely for ceremony tends to exaggerate shape, not refine it. It seeks to impress believers, not accommodate a practical user who may never return. The official story tells us these measurements are symbolic, but when symbolism demands perfect geometry, extreme precision, and engineering difficulty far beyond the needs of ritual, the explanation becomes strained. The stones do not behave like metaphors. They behave like remnants of something designed for everyday movement, scaled for a body that simply does not exist in the archaeological record. And so the first crack appears in the accepted timeline, not because the narrative is malicious or misguided, but because the stone itself refuses to play along. Something used these spaces with comfort, and whatever it was not built to our proportions. If the first anomaly challenges proportion, the second challenges purpose. Thousands of miles from the Andes, on the plains of central Mexico, stands Teotihuacan, a city whose architects remain anonymous even in their own homeland. Here, the contradiction sharpens. The staircases ascending the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon rise with a rhythm that does not match the cadence of human legs. Each step is too tall, too deep, too demanding. Even the most athletic visitor must climb them using hands and knees at times, as though the structure resists the shape of the human body. Tour guides explain this difficulty as deliberate, a way to humble worshippers on their ascent. But humility does not require engineering on this scale. It does not require building steps so disproportionate that human movement becomes unnatural. And it certainly does not require repeating the same mismatch throughout the entire city, across multiple buildings, platforms, and avenues. If it were symbolic, why maintain the same scale across every major structure? Why reinforce the same impractical standard again and again? The Avenue of the Dead, stretching more than a mile, reveals another clue. The platforms along its edges are arranged with uniformity, but their heights and widths are lined to a stride longer than ours. When charted using motion studies, the layout fits a gait somewhere between the step length of a tall modern human and something noticeably larger. Not twice our size, not monstrous, but consistently beyond the comfortable range of ancient populations. Then there is the matter of visibility. From the ground, the carvings and architectural lines that frame the upper terraces are almost impossible to see. They were not made for human eye level. They appear correctly proportioned only when viewed from much higher positions, as though the intended observer stood far above the ground, looking straight across instead of upward. The pattern is subtle, but once seen it becomes impossible to ignore. Oversized stairs, elevated viewpoints, platforms that anticipate longer strides, terraces positioned for eyes that no longer exist. Teotihuacan behaves like a city built to accommodate a taller species with different ergonomic needs. Mainstream interpretations focus on ceremony and spectacle. But even in ritual spaces, humans design for human bodies. We create stairs we can climb, thresholds we can pass through, carvings placed where believers can see them. Here the structures seem indifferent to us, as though we were never the intended users. And this is where the second crack in the official narrative forms, wider than the first. because when architecture across an entire city aligns to a scale slightly beyond our own, the explanation of symbolism begins to strain. Teotihuacan feels less like a stage built for human ritual, and more like a place constructed for beings who move through the world with a different sense of distance and height. If so, we are not inheritors of this city. We are merely its trespassers. The mainstream explanation, repeated across textbooks and museum plaques, frames these oversized features as ritual exaggeration. Ancient builders, it argues, were not concerned with comfort or practicality. They aimed to impress, intimidate, and elevate spiritual meaning. The tall doors symbolized divine thresholds. The steep steps forced humility. The massive chambers represented cosmic significance rather than physical use. In this view, the mismatch between architecture and human proportions is not a flaw, but an artistic choice. It is a reasonable interpretation, and it holds up well when examined from a distance. But when tested against the sites themselves, the explanation begins to lose its footing. Symbolism rarely demands such extreme precision. Ritual spaces do not require stones shaped with near-mechanical accuracy, and ceremonial exaggeration does not easily account for engineering choices that strain the limits of ancient technology. At Ollantaytambo, for example, the doorway framed as symbolic is cut with tolerances so tight that modern surveyors struggle to measure the deviation. These are functional tolerances, not theatrical ones. If the builders meant to create a metaphor, why embed such effort into areas never decorated, never painted, never used to convey ritual meaning? Teotihuacan raises the same question at a larger scale. If the purpose was purely spiritual, why construct so many stairways that reject the biomechanics of human ascent? Why use identical oversized proportions across buildings with different ceremonial purposes? And why place carvings at heights where no human participant could comfortably see them? Symbolism does not require repetition at this magnitude, nor does it explain the aerodynamic alignment of certain corridors, the controlled airflow in buried chambers, or the acoustic behavior of plazas that respond better to lower frequency resonance than to the human voice. Then comes the demographic issue. Ancient populations were not taller than modern ones. Skeletal remains at these sites show average heights that fall well within global norms. No population in these regions exhibited the stature needed to use the architecture comfortably. If the structures were built for symbolic purposes, they would still reflect the scale of the builders. Instead, they reflect a scale that the builders did not possess. Even more striking is the engineering expenditure. Moving stones weighing dozens of tons, shaping hard rock with precision, and aligning structures astronomically requires enormous labour. It is unlikely that ancient societies would devote such immense energy to create obstacles for worshippers or decorative features invisible from the ground. When ceremonial interpretation struggles to explain the physical evidence, the cracks widen. Not because the mainstream view is unreasonable, but because it relies on assumptions that cannot bear the weight of the stone. What remains is a simple and uncomfortable truth. The official explanation accounts for the story we wish to tell, not the measurements in front of us. And when story and stone diverge, it is the stone that tends to keep its integrity. Once you step outside a single site or region, the pattern spreads in a way that no symbolic explanation can comfortably contain. The same architectural contradictions appear in places separated by oceans, languages, and timelines, yet they echo one another with quiet precision. You begin to notice features that should be isolated coincidences, but instead behave like fragments of a single forgotten blueprint. Thousands of miles from the Andes and the Mexican plateau, the Nile Valley holds some of the most striking examples. In Egypt, the so-called oversized sarcophagi at Saqqara and the Serapeum stand out immediately. Their lids weigh dozens of tons. Their interiors are far larger than any human body, even those of the largest pharaohs. The official explanation portrays them as ceremonial containers, symbols rather than coffins. But the measurements tell a different story. These boxes are not artistic statements carved with freedom. They're engineered cavities with perfectly flat surfaces and right angles that defy tool marks. They resemble industrial components built to secure something of substantial size and weight, not symbolic metaphors for the afterlife. From Egypt, the pattern extends eastward. In parts of Turkey, Armenia, and northern Iran, ancient rock-cut chambers appear with ceilings so high that the intended user would need a much longer reach to interact with the space. Pillars rise to unnatural heights, not adorned with meaningful carvings, but shaped with a functional uniformity that suggests structural necessity for a larger frame. Then the pattern reaches Southeast Asia. At Angkor Thom in Cambodia, certain gateways dwarf human approach. Their openings appear tailored to something far taller than the average population of the region. Even today, elephants struggle to fit comfortably through them, and when digital reconstructions adjust scale to match the gateways, the resulting proportions align more closely with beings significantly taller than any known historical population. In the Pacific on Easter Island, the moai heads are often emphasized, but the platforms they stand on tell another story. Their bases are raised to a height suggesting eye-level interaction, not with humans on the ground, but with someone whose gaze met the statues directly. This proportion is rarely discussed because it raises questions that archaeology is not prepared to answer. Across Europe, early megalithic structures reinforce the pattern. Dolmens with entryways taller than necessary, standing stones arranged with spacing that does not match human stride, and chambers whose ceilings rise far higher than any practical need for burial practices. These are not anomalies in isolation. They're part of a repeating architectural language. And then there is Baalbek in Lebanon. The trilithon stones are often highlighted for their size, but the foundational platform beneath them reveals something else. Stair-like arrangements and ledges positioned at intervals too large for human use, yet too purposefully cut to be accidental. They exist halfway between steps and platforms, as if designed for a creature whose movement required larger footholds. Location after location, continent after continent, the same uneasy pattern appears. Architecture scaled for bodies that do not match human proportions. Precision that exceeds ceremonial needs. Functional features that imply ergonomic design for users who never appear in the archaeological record. These cultures did not interact. They shared no known blueprint, no overlapping myths, no common engineering school. Yet their structures express a similar contradiction, consistent enough to suggest neither coincidence nor symbolic intent. It is here, in the moment the pattern becomes global, that the question grows too large to ignore. Why does architecture from unconnected civilizations seem calibrated to a species that was never human? When a pattern repeats across continents, timelines, and cultures with no shared contact, the mind begins searching for a variable large enough to explain it. Not a dramatic one, not a sensational one, but a quiet structural truth that might sit beneath history the way bedrock sits beneath soil. Something that could influence architecture without leaving behind direct records. Something older than writing, older than the civilizations we know, older perhaps than the myths that tried to remember it. One possibility, the one most often avoided, is that these structures were inherited rather than invented, that the civilizations we credit with building them were modifying remnants of something that predated them. The stones would not reveal the identity of the earlier inhabitants, only their proportions, and the proportions, as we've seen, do not match our own. Another possibility is technological compression, the idea that the surviving timeline is far shorter and more fragmented than the reality. Catastrophes, population bottlenecks, and resets could erase entire chapters, leaving behind only architecture too durable to vanish. In such a scenario, the scale mismatch becomes a clue rather than an anomaly, a reminder of a time when the world hosted beings with different physical needs or different relationships to gravity, materials, and construction. A third possibility is cultural inheritance from a source we no longer recognize. A master template, a forgotten standard, passed down indirectly through ruins or oral traditions. In this view, humans built the structures but followed proportions that were not originally meant for us, preserving measurements that no longer made intuitive sense. Architecture becomes a fossil of instruction rather than a spontaneous creation. None of these possibilities require fantasy. They require only that history is incomplete, that the archaeological record is a narrow window rather than a full panorama. They require acknowledging that we base our understanding of ancient people on fragments, and that sometimes those fragments resist the shapes we try to force them into. The hidden variable might be as simple as this. The past contained more than one kind of inhabitant, not necessarily giants in the storytelling sense, not mythological beings of impossible height, but populations whose physiology differed subtly from ours. Taller, longer-limbed with different ergonomic requirements. If such populations existed, even for a limited time, their presence would leave behind architectural signatures. They would not leave bones if their numbers were small, or if their settlements lay in regions that have not survived erosion. But they would leave scale. Scale is stubborn. Scale endures. Or the hidden variable may involve something even more mundane. Environmental conditions that once allowed larger humans, or near humans, to thrive. Conditions that later changed. Climate shifts, atmospheric density, nutritional abundance, and other factors could support temporary deviations in body size. Architecture would record the high water mark of that possibility long after populations return to smaller norms. Whichever variable we consider, the key is this. The official timeline assumes consistent human proportions, consistent cultural invention, and consistent symbolic intent across every ancient site. Yet the stones reflect a world where something else existed, or at least where builders responded to needs that do not match ours. We do not have to choose a single explanation. We only have to accept that the scale mismatch is not random. It hints at a past more complex than our curated version, shaped by forces we have not fully traced. The hidden variable is the missing chapter, and architecture may be the last surviving witness to whoever or whatever shaped it. If earlier sections planted questions, this is where the physical evidence begins to tighten around them. Not theories, not speculation, but the measurements themselves, the photographs, the cuts in stone, the impossible angles that have no symbolic requirement and no human logic. When examined without preconceived explanations, the architecture behaves like data, and the data carries a quiet insistence. Consider first the issue of precision. At multiple sites, surfaces of hard igneous stone are planed so flat that even modern straight edges reveal no meaningful deviation. In Egypt's Serapeum, the interiors of the massive granite boxes show measurable flatness approaching machine quality. Their corners meet at perfect right angles. The lids weigh more than a fully loaded truck, yet they slide into place with a fit so exact that air compression becomes a factor. These are not ceremonial curiosities. They're engineered cavities, and their size suggests containment of something heavier and larger than a human body. Survey photographs confirm tool marks inconsistent with bronze chisels, while the hardness of the material requires pressure and control far beyond what handheld tools can achieve. If the boxes were symbolic, there would be no need for this level of precision. Symbolic art does not demand tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. Then consider scale mathematics. Population reconstructions at sites like Teotihuacan show labor forces that, while significant, would struggle to justify the energy expenditure needed to build stairs human beings can barely climb. When architectural ergonomics are calculated, the ratios align repeatedly with a stride length exceeding human average by a consistent percentage. A margin of error might explain one site. It does not explain repeated patterns across continents. In Peru, many blocks at Sacsayhuaman appear to have been shaped to interlock with precision curves and angles that modern masons find difficult to replicate. But equally striking is the height at which certain seams appear, seams positioned at levels reachable only from platforms or scaffolding that have left no trace. The most logical explanation is simple. The builders themselves could reach those heights naturally. Soil studies add another dimension. Layered beneath some of these structures are earlier occupation levels that show no evidence of constructing architecture at this scale. It is as if the people who lived above the foundations had inherited platforms far older than their own cultural layers. Stratigraphy does not reveal who built the earlier features, only that someone did, and that the earliest layers often correspond to the most oversized proportions. Maps complete the pattern. When you overlay global sites that contain scale mismatches, they form a distribution inconsistent with coincidence. They cluster along ancient trade routes that predate recorded trade, align with coastlines submerged at the end of the last ice age, or sit directly atop fault lines that may once have been hubs for resource extraction. The pattern is not random. It suggests movement, or at least cultural transmission, among groups we cannot place in the official timeline. Even acoustics offer clues. Plazas that respond better to lower frequencies than to the human voice. Chambers that resonate at pitches corresponding to larger thoracic cavities. Corridors that carry sound only when the source stands at a height above the human mouth. These spaces behave as though calibrated for vocal ranges and resonance points belonging to taller, larger-bodied individuals. When all this evidence is placed side by side, the impression shifts. It becomes harder to maintain that the features were symbolic, decorative, or arbitrary. The engineering, the precision, the ergonomic ratios, the global distribution, the geological layers, and the acoustic profiles converge toward a single conclusion. These structures were not designed around human bodies. They obey a different template, one that persists even when civilizations and languages change. And at some point, we must decide whether the evidence is hinting at coincidence or pointing towards something we have not yet allowed ourselves to consider. By now, the evidence forms a shape that is difficult to dismiss. Doorways that do not match our height, steps that refuse our stride, chambers too large for any human figure, boxes engineered for bodies that do not appear in our archaeological catalogue, patterns repeating across continents, across cultures, across eras, all pointing toward proportions that do not belong to us. And yet, the historical record remains silent. No texts describe people of this scale. No myths offer reliably detailed accounts. No skeletal remains confirm their existence. It is as if an entire chapter of the world was written in stone, but everything living that once moved through it has vanished. This is the moment the question sharpens. Not a question about fantasy or folklore, but about the structure of history itself. How much of our past is reconstructed from fragments too few to draw conclusions from? How many assumptions survive simply because they are comfortable? How often do we fit the world into our size, rather than noticing where the world refuses to shrink to match us? If the architecture was not designed for humans, then who or what were its intended occupants? Was there a population that lived briefly, leaving behind only the scale of its existence? Was there a pre-human culture lost to catastrophe, whose ruins became the foundations of later civilizations? Or was the world once home to variations of humanity that no longer walk among us? Variations whose bodies demanded different dimensions, different ergonomics, different thresholds. The stones cannot answer directly. They can only hold their silence, a silence that grows more unsettling the longer we listen. But the silence invites thought, and the thought leads to a doorway as tall as the ones carved into the mountain walls. What else have we mistaken for truth simply because it fit our shape? And how many other parts of our world still carry the imprint of hands, bodies and minds that archaeology has not yet learned to acknowledge? In the end, the world grows quiet again. The great stones return to their stillness, their surfaces catching only wind and dust, their proportions unchanged by the centuries of theories we place upon them. The oversized thresholds, the deep steps, the vast chambers all remain exactly as they have always been, indifferent to the explanations we prefer. They do not argue, they do not confirm, they simply endure. Standing before them, it is difficult not to feel a sense of distance, a distance not measured in time or geography, but in understanding. These structures seem to look past us, as if remembering a rhythm of movement that no longer exists, waiting for footsteps that do not match our own. And in that distance lies a humility that our modern world rarely asks of us. We often assume the past was smaller than the present, simpler, easier to comprehend. But these places suggest the opposite. They hint at a world layered with forgotten complexities, shaped by decisions we no longer recognize, guided by hands that perhaps did not resemble ours. They remind us that the earth holds more memory than we do, and that memory is written most clearly in stone. Perhaps the true mystery is not who built these structures, or for whom, but why the proportions feel so strangely familiar, as though touching a buried intuition we cannot fully name. Something within us responds, not with certainty, but with recognition of a story half remembered, and so we leave the ruins behind, carrying more questions than answers, aware that the silence they keep is deliberate, careful, and ancient. If you seek forgotten structures, lost patterns, and the quiet puzzles of our world, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting in the stones, and each one asks us to listen a little more closely. Because some monuments were not built for humans, and they have been waiting a very long time for us to notice.